All right, I don't want to take up any more time from our guest today. If you have read anything in the Idaho Statesman in the past 3 decades about the environment, it has probably had Rocky's fingers on it. So we are so very lucky to have a journalist perspective at this point in our class. Please feel free to throw questions up in the chat as you think of them while Rocky talks with us, and we'll have some good time for discussion towards the end. Rocky has lots of expertise in the areas that we've talked about already: salmon, wolves, Native American perspectives, and all kinds of expertise in across the kinds of public lands that we've been talking about. So please take advantage of that and think about what those questions might be towards the end. A couple quick reminders. If you are not talking, please keep your microphone on mute. If you're able to, please turn your camera on so we can see your beautiful faces as we converse this morning. There aren't any slides, so we will be just looking at each other and listening carefully. And please remember that you are being recorded. Okay, I think that's everything. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Eli.
Hi, everybody, and good morning. Today we have the privilege to hear from Idaho Statesman journalist Rocky Barker. Rocky graduated with his bachelor's in environmental studies from Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. He was also awarded an alumni award for environmental achievement there. He has written multiple very successful books, and he was a finalist for the Western Writers of America Spur Award for his book, Scorched Earth: How the Fires of Yellowstone Changed America. He has been a journalist for 45 years, ranging on issues from mining in Wisconsin to acid rain in Canada, rainforest protection in Hawaii, to fish and wildlife conservation in Russia's Far East and Africa. I was told not to worry too much about speaking on his achievements during my introduction, so let me just say he is very well decorated for his excellent work over the years, including his book, Idaho Wilderness Considered, and that received the 2017 Idaho Book of the Year Award. So without taking up any more of his time, please welcome me in joining Rocky Barker to our virtual stage.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks, everyone. I'm really honored to be here and to kind of try to fill the shoes of my great friend and partner, John Freeman. And, when I say partner, I mean, we were real partners with the Andrews Center for Public Policy. I helped, going all the way back to the 90s, we worked on conferences on the Snake River, on fires, on the press in the West, rural Idaho, all kinds of issues. And they were partially because John and I kind of came at the world from the same place. I'm a journalist. My job is to try to tell the truth as I see it. And from my standpoint, also plausible alternatives to what I see. In other words, I know I'm not always right in what I see, even that I put together. But what and also, my responsibility was to make sure that my readers could see themselves in my story. And you think about that here in the West, that meant people from ranchers and miners and loggers to academics and environmentalists and policymakers, bureaucrats, the wide range of public. And John saw that too. And one of the things John used to say, that, sometimes, there's a lot of people who, like you guys, who understand the intricacies of public land issues and public policy and stuff. But a lot of people don't understand anything. Like he used to tell the story about when he was working at Glen Canyon, the National Recreation Area. He had a visitor one time come up to him and said, "So which side of the dam is the lake on? And if you're sitting there, it's pretty obvious. And they were sitting there. So, and then the other people, he really felt he suffered poorly, was how we in the press, particularly the further away we got from the West, our understanding of public lands. One time the Washington Post had this big lofty editorial about national forest policy, and he called national forest in the West national parks. He just, it just drove him nuts, that kind of thing. When I was covering the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge takeover by our neighbor Ammon Bundy and his crew, John was being interviewed by a reporter from back east, and John is kind of going over and over about the BLM and the BLM this and the BLM land, and how that was playing into this whole issue. And the person goes, so I don't understand. Why is it that Black Lives Matter is an issue in this thing? And, so that's kind of the way. And that was, now 4 years ago, Black Lives Matter was not on the radar screen in the same way it is today. And so anyway, that was kind of the way John looked at these things. I learned a lot from John. And one of the people, John, he took he had his degree from Colorado State University, and he learned from a professor that I don't know if other people have talked about, Philip Foss. But Philip Foss was kind of John's mentor. He was, and the guy that I think John felt the most comfortable with. He's the guy who taught John to a certain degree to help guide John to the way that he thought about these kind of issues. And one of the things John and I got to Dr. Foss through the back door, because I learned about Dr. Foss from Bob Barbie. I don't know if you've heard his name. He was the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park during the fires of 1988. And I covered the fires of 1988, and I spent countless hours with Bob, talking about public policy in general. And he told me that the reason he could, at the time they were calling Bob Barbie, the fire, a barbecue. He was taking so much criticism for the way the decisions he was making during the fire. And he said he didn't have any problem with that. He said, Dr. Foss taught me that, to study an issue, debate, or controversy, not by becoming an advocate for either side, but by looking at the forces, ideas that strengthen conflicting views. As Bob told me, that doesn't mean you take some kind of clinical stance. You can't divorce yourself from your values, and you shouldn't. But if you're going to be a success, I needed to learn how to win. And in other words, it was for him as a decision maker, as a person managing public lands, he had to divorce himself from these. He didn't have to walk away from his values, but he had to recognize what were the different things that were essentially going to win out on whatever issue he was making. And John saw that and analyzed that throughout his time here. And from everything, you've had people talk about national monuments. John was a real expert on, on the whole, the Antiquities Act and all kinds of laws that we've watched play out. John very understood in depth what it meant when you were talking about transferring of public lands from the federal government to the states. And because of that, his skepticism about it wasn't just personal. He just knew that what it really meant. And he knew, having looked at the history of it and at the way that the argument had always worked through, he always knew that in the end, it meant that those lands, the people pushing that idea ultimately were pushing it from the public to the personal in terms of land control. And so, you know, he wasn't telling, I mean, he personally didn't want that to happen, but he wasn't making that case because he wanted the people actually who were advocating that to understand that, because he didn't think and he was right, most of the people in Idaho who were advocating transfer of public lands really didn't want the lands to go into private ownership. They really wanted it to be, they had this vision that it would be the state would take over and they'll do it more efficiently, just like they do state lands. And, you know, and you know, it was basically a Pollyannish view. And one of the things that John recognized right away, okay, so let me get this straight. So we're going to change all of the infrastructure of public lands. What are we going to pay the state? I mean, who's going to pay for that? And it's either going to be the state taxpayers or the federal government. Well, what does the federal government, we, in other words, not just the federal government, we, the public, get? What's the advantage we would get from changing the federal lands to state? And, you know, Johns was always saying, hey, I understand some value in that, but is that value more or higher than the cost it's going to be for making that transfer? Like, who's going to fight fires? Who's going to pay for land management? There's always been this myth that, oh, we'll be able to pay for it with the resources themselves. Well, in some places that's true. That's why Utah, for instance, is very interested in public land transfer, because there's a whole lot of oil and gas resources there that if the federal government turned over all those resources along with the land, then they could maybe cover a whole lot of the cost of managing that land. But in the past, as John would tell you in history, going back to the late 20s when the Herbert Hoover administration actually looked at transferring that land, they decided that they wanted to hold on to the mineral resources. And faced with that, states like Utah said, no thanks, we don't want it. And so anyway, that was kind of John's way. And as a journalist, I'm also in that same boat. As I want to, I've always looked at my public land coverage, but also most of my environmental coverage in general, as mostly a clash of values. You know, I've always told people, other journalists, you know, don't go telling me about process. Oh God, nobody reads process stories. They don't care about forest plans or resource management plans. They care about people. They care about critters. They care about places. And if you think that science and economics are going to determine the outcome of any decision, I can tell you in 45 years, I haven't seen it. They are the tools of the debate. And the decisions are almost always made by cultural and political considerations. If you get nothing from my talk today, I hope that you take and examine that, because that's really important to understand. Now, that doesn't make the science impacts the various, for one, the scientific arguments, because, you know, often those arguments are often those arguments are just, there really are good debates, scientific debates. But then John would tell us all the time that, okay, you still have to look at what how the scientists are acting in the public square. If scientists are doing their science, in other words, taking their research and then presenting it in the public square, that's one thing. But when scientists sign a whole letter of all these scientists don't believe in this EIS on salmon, those scientists are not taking a scientific position. They are taking a political position. Now, they may be taking a political position based on science, but they've stepped out of their normal role and taken this other way of engaging. It's not that it's inappropriate or improper, but you just got to understand it as you're trying to make those kind of decisions. So I want to switch gears a little bit. So I came to Idaho in 1985. I had been the editor of the Rhinelander Daily News in Wisconsin, which at that time was a very Democratic state. There was no polarization. It was, pretty much the Democrats had the same control over Wisconsin that the Republicans have here in Idaho. Now, as you know, that's changed dramatically. Last week, it was, there was about a percentage point between the voters in Wisconsin. So that's changed a lot. But where I had spent a lot of time there covering Exxon Minerals want to develop one of the largest copper zinc deposits in the country. And what was fascinating to me in reporting and covering that was that the mining company was, of course, doing everything it could to sell its point of view, but the environmental community and particularly the state, but environmentalists and the mining company were evenly matched enough that they both decided to sit down with the tribes and with local government and begin what was called at the time the consensus process. And I spent about 4 or 5 years covering this consensus process, developing the regulations in Wisconsin to manage mining. Well, when I left, the mining industry kind of looked at those regulations as they weren't the way they wanted them, because as they called Wisconsin the People's Republic of Wisconsin, because of the heavy regulations. So basically, it came down to this: the mining industry thought it should be able to make changes in water quality up to the level of drinking water, and the environmental community did not think that those relatively high levels of pollution should be in their pristine streams like the Wolf River. So I moved to Idaho, and one other thing, the environmental community there was their quote left were people who just thought that the consensus process had sold them down the river, because they were going to essentially allow mining, to have impacts on the state, and they didn't want it. So they would use any argument that they could think of to do that. I mean, one of the ones that they loved was I actually sat in a meeting where the environmental leader was talking to other advocates and saying, make sure that you bring up nuclear power. Nuclear, make them understand that there's uranium in this deposit, and there are going to be all kinds of contamination if they do this. And I knew the facts, we were talking about very small levels of uranium in this deposit. It was not really a serious issue. And so they basically I, as a journalist, became kind of skeptical when those folks were talking to me. Now, I moved to Idaho, and the very first thing I'm covering, I answered an ad that said, cover Yellowstone grizzlies and 3 Mile Island cleanup. And I can tell you, as an environmental reporter, I go, that's for me. It was a dream. And I moved to Idaho Falls. I'm 100 miles from Yellowstone, but I'm also 60 miles from the Idaho National Laboratory. And so I'm now living in a town that is completely dominated by people in the nuclear industry. It was fascinating. It was really a culture change for me. And of course, it also was a town dominated by members of the Church of Latter-day Saints too, which also was a culture change. But the main thing that I had to kind of get used to right away was the environmental community over there were all nukers. The people who had, in the history of Idaho, when you look at the history of environmental protection of public lands in Idaho, names like Russ Brown and Jerry Jane and Boyd Norton are revered for their efforts to save the Sawtooth, to save Hell's Canyon, Gospel Hump, and all kinds of places in the state. And they were the ones who had the facts. They were the ones who weren't spinning every issue. They were showing me, because these are a bunch of scientists or scientific people who were working as advocates, but they were using their tool of science to make their case, or economics to make their case. Russ Brown convinced the whole nation. He got up by showing the 19-page environmental impact statement for the Teton Dam. Now, the Teton Dam failed in 1976. In 1971, Russ Brown is this nuclear scientist, air advocate, and math genius. He's pulling out their benefits, and he makes it really clear that the public benefits of this dam, were almost non-existent, and that we were going. And this 19-page environmental impact statement was totally inadequate. And and he was just, beaten down in Idaho. Nobody listened to him. But in 1976, suddenly, Russ Brown looked like the genius he was. And so I moved there in 1985, and I'm listening to the Russ Browns and the Jerry Jane. Jerry Jane was a computer programmer. Boyd Norton was a computer expert, and also he's the guy who actually pushed the button when they melted down a reactor called the spurt reactor. And the neat thing about Idaho Falls, I was there when they melted down the loft reactor, and all of a sudden, all these people are sitting around. Yay! They were cheering. They were drinking champagne. We have successfully melted down a nuclear reactor, just like they did at 3 Mile Island. That was a kind of a new thing for me at the time. But it was all in the nature of research. But these same people were taking on the Jim McClure's, the timber industry, the mining industry, as Russ used to call them, the water welfare big daddies, essentially the irrigators, and basically the power structure of Idaho. And the power structure of Idaho was all tied to natural resources at that time. When I got there, Micron was a relatively small company, and we thought our whole economic future was tied to logging and mining and agriculture. Now, make no mistake, agriculture was and is a major part of our state economy, but timber was going down even then, not even just for environmental issues, but because of efficiency. The mills no longer needed as many employees. And mining had already dropped dramatically in Idaho when I got here. But the timber industry was kind of at the top of the as they called them, the timber wars. And the environmental community was pushing to get more wilderness, and the timber industry was pushing to get more timber out of the woods. And so these timber wars were taking place in every forum. And for me, it was a great way to learn what was going on in the West, because I'm sitting in hearing rooms and watching people demonize each other, and I'm getting to know people on both sides. The nice thing about being a journalist is you get to walk in all camps. So even as I came, I have a degree in environmental studies, and make no mistake, when I came here, I clearly leaned very environmental. And, I could go into a depth about how environmental journalists are a part of the environmental movement, which sometimes people get uncomfortable when they hear journalists are a part of a movement. But, just by the fact that we care about that issue inherently meant we looked at issues through those lenses. But I also grew up on a farm. So I felt pretty comfortable walking, or going out with ranchers on Roundup, doing what was a standard and remains a standard of Bureau of Land Management and rancher relations, going out on a walk, through public lands where there's cattle, and talking about what they see together. And that was very interesting for me. When I would see, for instance, this is 1985, and I would see a creek where the water table has dropped, 10 feet, and the creek's down, it's eroded out the entire area. And the ranchers look at, the BLM's biologist or hydrologist is sitting there giving a talk and says, this is a perfect example of what happens when we don't manage our riparian areas correctly. And there's these old, what I would call today, old bull ranchers. These guys had been managing this land, and they've been running their cattle on this land for years. Some of these guys 50 years, and they're hearing this scientist telling them this, and they're going, boy, are you stupid? That all happened when we had that flood back in 1974, and it all blew out. And that had nothing to do with our cattle ranching. And so that's the kind of, two people looking at the same thing at the same time. It might be up in the forest. You'd walk out there with a bunch of timber industry guys, and they'd be looking at a clear cut, and they'd be talking about how well that area was cut for the benefit of, because they left for the benefit of birds, because they left a certain number of snags per acre. And then you go there with the environmentalist, and they'd be going, now get down on the ground and look at the dirt and see how much of this is washing away. And they were both right. And so I'm trying as a journalist to put all of that out there. And then the whole interest of economics in timber. This is, by the time I got here in the late 80s, it was obvious to most that building new roads into these roadless areas was not a paying proposition. The amount, there are certainly because you think about it, they've been really cutting all this timber since the 1950s. And they've been cutting, especially beginning in the 1960s, the Forest Service has really gone to a clear cutting as their primary tool for managing these forest lands, because in their mind, they were trained as foresters, we need to, make this an efficient timber stand, and the best way to do it is to start all over. And if it's lodgepole pine, it was going to bring itself back. If it was, Doug fir, they would replant it, and they would show you the silvicultural charts of how much more growth they got every year out of that forest by doing that. Well, of course, that meant that all the other values in the forest didn't matter to the people who were trained in the 50s, or if they did matter, they mattered as a kind of added benefit, not necessarily a reason. So, if it had an impact on wildlife, they tried to minimize the impact on wildlife, because the job was, to get the timber out. And that started, of course, then the whole 60s were this period of where the period of Earth Day. I always tell people I'm a child of Earth Day. I went to college at Northland in 1971, a year after Earth Day. And in the Forest Service, the people I was covering, they identified themselves as the pre-69ers and the post-69ers. The pre-69ers were the people in the Forest Service, who got their education, came into the Forest Service under the kind of post-1950s era. And then the post-69ers were the people of Earth Day, the people who came out of college, just as the environmental revolution was beginning. And you could see the clashes within the Forest Service themselves. And, I had many friends on both sides of that. I learned so much from, in my career, from talking with the, quote, pre-69ers about how the policies we had happened. But one of the main policies in place were the laws that paid for national forest to be, you could pay, the Forest Service had this great tool. They got to keep, they'd stick all this money from a timber sale in these funds that they then got to use for replanting, for road building, for all the things that they do. And so they had, as a bureaucracy, this amazing ability, and then they had the timber industry to help support that, firefighting and stuff. All of that came out of these funds that Congress had given them. And so so one of the first things that the environmental community, I think, successfully did was demonstrate that these timber harvests in the early 70s were costing more money than they were making. And the deficit timber sale argument really became the argument that really, even more so than the cost of the lawsuits over endangered species and water quality, which were in Idaho. If you talk to the timber folks, they pointed to that as why they lost the timber wars, so to speak. But in fact, a lot of conservatives in Congress joined the environmental community in not wanting to deficit timber sale, anymore. They wanted to avoid that. And so what that did was there were all these in Idaho, about 9 million acres of roadless land that, of course, the Clinton roadless rule got rid of. So, so by the end of, by that time, we're talking now 2000 and 2001, when Clinton actually put in place the roadless rule nationally, that basically all but stopped timber sales and activities in these roadless lands. Well, Idaho and the timber industry hated that. And and as soon as Bush got in, Idaho was able to develop a roadless process of their own. We were gonna do our own roadless process that was going to try to do the same thing, but make it more possible to manage in the roadless areas. And the guy who did the work on it was a guy named Jim Caswell, who was a forest supervisor over the years. But Caswell did all the work. He made the presentation, and while he's making the presentation, the Bush administration lost a major lawsuit over their version of what they wanted to do in the roadless rule. So with that in mind, they, it basically was over. Jim Risch, though, suddenly becomes governor of Idaho when Dirk Kempthorne goes to Washington, D.C. as Interior Secretary. And Risch takes the Idaho plan, and he takes a look at it, and he and Caswell make some changes that they think will get around the lawsuit that had happened in California. And they go to the National Committee on Roadless that the Forest Service had put in place, and they succeeded. Jim Risch got up at the meeting and said, "Our plan has as much protection or more than the Clinton roadless plan." And there's a guy on that committee named Chris Wood, who was one of the guys who wrote the Clinton roadless plan. And he also happened to be a really sharp he was one of the political players in the Forest Service, and working for Mike Dombeck at the time. But now he was at Trout and Lemon, and he just grabbed the idea. Well, if you really believe that's true, Governor Risch, let's work together and let's get your plan approved, and I will help you do that. And it was pretty amazing. It was great politics. And together, they worked with all of the members of the National Committee, and Risch reached out to the Idaho Conservation League and to other environmentalists to put together this, this Idaho roadless plan that eventually was approved. And they took out, maybe about a million acres that some of the mining companies wanted over in eastern Idaho. And they put in some rules that made it easier for cities, for instance, to do management up in their watersheds, which actually was pretty important because a lot of the watersheds were roadless. And, we were starting in 2000 to see them all burned. And we needed to have some tools for management. So that collaborative process was, one of the growing collaboratives where people on all sides sat around the table together. They learned together about what each other wanted to know, and they, they also were able to. They also were able to learn about each other, and they started to trust each other. And this took me back to Wisconsin in 1985 and the consensus groups that wrote the mining law there. Now, if you're on the side of miners and loggers, you might take a you might take a care about that consensus group's outcome, because Exxon ended up selling the the Crandon deposit. It's never been developed. Actually, what ended up happening was it ended up getting sold to the Sakagan Chippewa tribe, who was one of the opponents of the mine. And I'm guessing that that mine won't open until many, many decades, maybe when, there's another time and a place, which is to a certain degree the way that the environmentalists on the committee wanted. Is they wanted the mines to be opened, by instead of the ones that could be exploited the easiest, the ones that could be, that had the protections, had the best protections potential. So, but the fact is it didn't happen. So if you would look at even the roadless bill, what happened actually on roadless is Idahoans came to realize they all, whether you live in a small town like Orofino or whether you live in Boise, it's those roadless lands that hold your elk. It's those roadless lands that are that give us the wildness that make our state what it is. And we started to recognize the value in leaving those lands as they were. And so that's one of the things that happened there. I also covered the Hawaii process, where in 2001, I'm flying, or in 2000, I'm flying up to Craters of the Moon with Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt. And he calls me up, and I've known Babbitt for quite a few years by that point. And Rocky, you need to come here. I'm thinking about expanding Craters of the Moon National Monument. Come with me. I'm going to go meet a bunch of ranchers up there. And it was, it was a grand, press gesture. He's got the ranchers who were going to be affected in the area, and he gets out the maps of this area with the ranchers, and I took a picture of he and the ranchers looking at the map, and every one of the ranchers under their breath was going, "This is bullshit." They were not happy. They didn't want it, but they recognized they didn't have any choice in the matter because of the Antiquities Act. And so they were going to take what he was willing to give them, so to speak. They were saying, "Well, we need this, we need this, and we need this," and he said, "Okay, I'll put that on the map," and he did all of that, and they ended. And on the way back, we're flying in the jet, in the jet that's bringing him there, and he turns to me and he goes, "So Rocky, I'm getting all this pressure from the environmental community that I ought to get Clinton to name the Hawaii Canyonlands National Monument. You see, you see how I'm doing this with Craters. I got to meet with people. I got to get at least some buy-in. You think I can get that buy-in in the Hawaiis?" Well, I had just walked the week before out of a meeting in Nampa that Helen Chenoweth had held on the Hawaiis. And these people were as angry as I had ever seen public lands people. They were mad. And Helen, Helen was she was an orator. She could work that crowd into a frenzy. And she had done that, and she had made it clear that don't come here. If you come here, we're going to blow it up. And that's what I told him. So he must have listened to me, because when they put out the Craters of the Moon monument message from Clinton, he said, well, we believe the Hawaii Canyonlands deserves national monument status, but we just don't have time to do that, and we hope that maybe some people could get together in the same kind of process that we've used for some of our other lands, like I can't remember the mountain over in Oregon, but and so he said, go to it. Well, that began. Hawaii County got the message, and Hawaii County was one of these counties who had a very strong belief that they should have more say over the public lands in the county, and they had a public land use committee, and in which they were trying to exercise that right. And they hired this guy Grant, who came in, and he told them, look, we need to get everybody together. We need to write a bill on our terms that protects this area, but also protects our ranching interests. And he reached out to Larry Craig and to Mike Crapo, asking for their help in managing this process. Well, Larry Craig didn't want to have anything to do with it. But Crapo, it fit right into Mike Crapo's rhetoric at the time. He had just sent a copy of a gentleman named Dan Kemmis, who was a former mayor of Missoula. The book was called Community and the Politics of Place. And it was really about how the West needed to, on the local level, come to a decision that connected both the national interest and the local interest into the decision making. And of course, John Freemuth was one of the people who'd been advocating that very same thing at that time. And so Crapo, he took that on, and it took him 10 years to write that bill. And the bill ended up protecting 500,000 acres of wilderness in Hawaii County. It did a whole bunch of land trades and management shifts to give the ranchers what they wanted. The ranchers actually helped draw the wilderness boundaries to make sure they were exactly what they want. But the most important thing that came out of it was that these people had figured out that, those environmentalists aren't so bad. Maybe we can partner with these guys on a lot of things. The motorized users, who, by the way, were a part of the process, the motorized users are, they're just running all over our place. And the fact is, it's true, John Marvel isn't the only guy attacking our business. Economics are attacking our business. So we've got to find things to protect our values. And so today, all the way today, that bill passed, by the way, in 2009. And then in 2015, Idaho passed the Boulder White Clouds wilderness bill that protected wilderness up in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and connected BLM lands. And what was really fascinating about that, it was a different process completely. But in the end, it was the same kind of a thing where people on both sides were working together to get what they wanted. And again, being a journalist, in the end, I actually, you know, I got to play a little role. You know, I'm reporting on all this, but I reported, I had a meeting with Raw Labrador's staff, and I wanted to do an interview with Labrador about the Boulder White Clouds, because he had said that, you know, he was against it. But, and he actually had kind of put a hold on Mike Simpson, his fellow Republican's bill, in the House Resources Committee. And he had met with Rick Johnson, who spoke to you guys earlier, on a Monday. And at the end of that day, Rick Johnson told me, I just finished talking to Raw Labrador, and he told me he's ready to support this bill, certainly to take the hold off of it. And so I called up the committee and I said, so has Raw Labrador taken the hold off of that bill? And they said, no, it's still held up. So I called a woman named Sandra Mitchell, who is the head of the Snowmobile Association and other motorized interest in Idaho, and had been one of the major opponents to Simpson's wilderness bill, and certainly the national monument that had been proposed up in the Boulder White Clouds, because of the concern she had for her motorized users. But by the time the bill we were at that point, she actually supported the bill. But her power, her influence was in the Republican side of the committee that Rob Bishop from Utah chaired. So I called her. She happened to have been up in Alaska on vacation. And I said, Sandra, I just heard, what do you think about this? The bill that you now support is being held up in committee. Are you going to do anything about it, or do you really support Raul on this? Because you're one of Raul's biggest supporters. And she said, give me a minute, Rocky. Click. And she never did call me back. But the next day, I reported that the committee had, in fact, that Raul had lifted his hold. It went through the committee unanimously. It went through the House unanimously. And then it ended up in a real trick of legislative process. They caught Ted Cruz when he was in the middle of a campaign trip, and he was not paying attention, because he would have stopped it. And Jim Risch, as soon as he had that opening, Jim Risch brought it to the floor. They got it there. Who supports this? I'll say aye. And it passed the Senate unanimously. So, you know, and remember, that's 2015. We were still in the middle of the same polarization that, frankly, we're in right now. So the Idaho way of had been this, but the key issue of all this that I wanted to say here, I'm looking at my time. The key issue in all this is, during all this time, the environmental community, the ranching community, and the folks who were going to work in the Forest Service, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and all of them were all taking John's class together. And so they were learning together how these processes worked, how the kind of things that they wanted. If they wanted to get something, here's the processes, here are the influences, you know, here are the different things that affect the final decisions. And they were learning together. And at the same time, they were getting to know each other. So by the time we've gotten to the 2000s, this is just the way things are done in Idaho. I don't know how many of you know this, although I'll bet you Rick told you. One of the more interesting things is that the largest purchaser of timber on federal lands in the country right now is Idaho Timber Corp up in North Idaho. And their timber manager is a guy named Alan Harper, and he's on the board of the Idaho Conservation League. Now, so what? If you would have even suggested something like that in 1985, everybody would have laughed. There was nobody who believes that kind of thing, could be like that. But in fact, that's the way people work. On the Hawaii initiative now, Brenda Richards is a rancher and was the president of the Public Lands Council, which is the main lobbying group in Washington for ranching interests. And she is also one of the people involved in the Hawaii process. Her big partner today through all this is Craig Yerke, who's the local representative of the Wilderness Society. And they work, they end each other's sentences. They work together in getting these kind of things, the kind of things they both want done. And, I'm hopeful as we move into this new administration who says that its job is to reach out across for policy making, that maybe we can break down some of the polarization. But there's also a whole lot of other stuff happening at the same time. In Idaho, for instance, we're having a lot of new people moving in from California who are pretty conservative, who are very ideological, and are very skeptical of government in general. And that's made us, and the same people are moving to Montana, which, by the way, in this election, essentially became Idaho politically. So it's going to be for some interesting times. I think, what do you think? Is that a good place to end, Emily? And I'd love to take questions.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking Rocky for that wonderful set of experiences and advice and really interesting insights into some of the changes. There's quite a few questions that have to do with this theme of cooperation and collaboration. So I think we'll go to Daniel first, and then maybe let Alyssa Molis and Christopher follow up if their angles on the question don't quite get answered. Those seem thematically pretty linked. So go for it, Daniel.
Great.
Well, cooperation between diverse groups seems to be the only way to get things done. Do you feel that journalists play a role in bringing together groups that might be at odds? And if so, what do you think that role is?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I've unashamed worn my bias on my sleeve for collaboration, for people who are willing to sit down at the table. And that means I make some decisions that traditional journalists might make differently. And I accept that some people question my ethics in that regard. Because, for instance, when I see that, if I've got a story out there that might really get me, I need to tell that story, my God. But then I know that if I tell that story now, it might blow up a collaborative process. I do weigh that story. I weigh that. And that's a hard decision that both reporters and editors, have to be careful. I have to be careful that I'm not getting myself sucked in, so that there's a lot of people who aren't at the table too. And those people deserve to know what's going on. They need transparency, and that tension for me between my job of doing transparency and encouraging and helping people to work together on a collaborative process. That's been kind of the way I've looked at it. There's a tension, and sometimes I don't have a choice. When something is going on that is, that the public I believe the public needs to know, I'm going to tell it, even if it does blow up a process. And I'll give you an example. The Clearwater has had a fairly successful collaborative process that Crapo has run, and but it was becoming clear that the elected officials involved in that process were giving up on the interest of their collaborative partners, i.e. the wilderness advocates, and that there just wasn't going to be any chance for them to work together. And so I reported that, and but it's not like I was at that point that I'm reporting it. It was already so bad that the county was going soon after put on the ballot, no more wilderness in Idaho County. So by reporting that ahead of that, I was signaling to the people who were paying attention that probably this collaborative process was falling apart. So.
Thank you. It seems like you walk a fine line. Thank you for that.
Well, it's also the greatest and most fun job in the West. I mean, I've had so much. It's just so cool. The chances I got to watch the wolves. Wolf reintroduction. I watched them come out of the cages at Corn Creek in January of 1995 in Idaho, and then in March I was in Yellowstone when they came out of the. They called them enclosures. I called them kennels, and started howling. And that was just a remarkable experience. So and of course I covered the Yellowstone fires. Almost burned up, I mean this. So I've essentially had a front seat for Western environmental history.
Well, let's talk about critters a little bit. Alyssa Wolf had a question about the wolves, and Stephanie had one about salmon, and then maybe we can loop back if there's some other questions that have to do with changing attitudes over time. So Alyssa, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, mine was on wolf reintroduction. We could talk towards the Yellowstone one. That was what my paper was going to be on if you want to. But do you believe that the role of press on wolf reintroduction in Western states has impacted the process of public lands and how the public perceives it?
Absolutely. It's both sides had their reasons to play to the press. And I would suggest that the people who wanted to keep wolves from being reintroduced were mostly working the local press in their community, in the communities, and in the states, whereas the people trying to get wolves reintroduced were working the national press, and it was quite interesting. And John Freemuth, by the way, played a critical role in that in the 90s, because he did a study. He managed a study from Boise State in 1992 that was the first study that showed that Westerners, and especially Idahoans, actually liked wolves and wanted wolves. And that went totally against what the ranch community and the politicians were saying. And so yeah, they played a pretty big role. It was, and I think that we came to a one of the things you're doing your paper on Yellowstone, of course, in part because Yellowstone's, everybody loves Yellowstone. So the way this worked out is most people didn't hardly even pay attention to Idaho. They didn't care what happened in Idaho. They cared about Yellowstone. So, the various groups on the side used that. We had wolves in Idaho in the 1990s, and there were people in the environmental community who wanted them to, for one, they wanted to call it augmenting rather than reintroducing, because they wanted the recognition that the wolves were there. But then there were other people in the environmental community who said, no, let's just keep them on the Endangered Species Act and full protection. When I did my 25th anniversary story, I did a what if story. What if we hadn't reintroduced? Where would the wolf populations be today? And talking to the experts, I was convinced that we would have about 150 wolves maybe in Idaho, and that they'd be starting to grow kind of like they did around 2000 right about now, but it would have been a very slow process getting us to that number. But in Yellowstone, I think that they would have, I don't think that they would have reached critical mass without reintroduction. And so, so when you look at the two processes, what was good? If we'd have had them come back under the Endangered Species Act, would Idahoans have called them Canadian wolves? Would they be so demonized that they stuffed their wolves down our throat? Maybe not. And if we look at what's going on right now, for instance, with grizzly bears in central Idaho, we're not hearing the same kind of thing because those grizzly bears are walking into central Idaho from North Idaho. And, we also had a process for reintroducing there that got stopped. And that process would have reduced the protection for those grizzlies in the Bitterroot recovery zone. And grizzly bears are very different than wolves. And you lose one grizzly, it's they're not very fecund, and they're just not as productive. So wolves, when they take off, they can take off. They have extra pups if they have to. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rocky. We have time probably for one more question. Go for it, Stephanie, if you're ready to go, or if anybody else has one, we might be able to stay on a few minutes.
Yeah, I was just curious. You mentioned right before we started class that you were the most passionate about salmon. And I was just wondering if that was something that you were excited about when you lived on the other side of the country, or if that's something that that you got into after moving to Idaho. And I guess just kind of your experiences with covering stories about salmon in the Northwest.
Well, first, yeah, I cared about salmon in the Great Lakes. I was even more than I am today, a fishing nut as a young man. I was a guide in northern Wisconsin, and that included Lake Superior. We were on the lake, and we had coho salmon and Chinook kings there that had been reintroduced in the 60s. And so I like this, but it wasn't that big an issue in my head, for just salmon. And I moved to Idaho in '85, and right away in '86, I went up to salmon and got a chance to fish for steelhead. And I started, oh, this is really interesting. But, I said, what about salmon? And they go, oh, salmon are gone. Don't worry, they're gone. So when in 1990, when the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, decided to petition to list sockeye as an endangered species, that's when I really got passionate about it. I did a series for the Idaho Statesman on endangered species, in which became my book, Saving All the Parts. And salmon was a key part of that story, because I basically was arguing that the Endangered Species Act would reach into the lives of every single person in the Columbia Basin, an area the size of France. And that's because it's so powerful. And then I explained through a whole lot of species, salmon, wolves, and all that. But then, I came to the Statesman in '96, and in '97, John Costa, my boss, came to me and said, I heard you and Crapo talking in that meeting, and it sounded like you almost could make the case that if we took out those 4 dams on the Snake River, that would be more in Idaho's interest than keeping them there. And I said, that could be argued. And he said, okay, you've got a month. I want you to talk to everybody. I want you to gather all the information and give it to the editorial board, because we're going to write a series of editorials. And I think we're going to call for breaching the 4 lower Snake dams. Okay. So I went out and I talked to everybody. I wrote a long memo that told the pros and the cons, the economics, and we ended up doing a 3-part series that I have to say, again, changed the world a little bit. Because when we did it, it just happened to be the same time that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was deciding to take out the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Maine. And so essentially our series and the actual ruling, and Bruce Babbitt said this, was the beginning of the river restoration movement in the United States. And today there's more than 1,500 dams that have been removed, successfully restoring fish, but especially salmon, and in the rivers. And so obviously you can tell I have a point of view, no doubt about it. First, my main point of view, though, is based on the science. When I looked at it in '97, it was pretty clear that the best way to save salmon on the Snake River Basin was to take out the 4 lower Snake dams. And the economics we had proven were clear, but we understood that the culture and politics was a pretty heavy lift. So here we are today, 23 years later, and I don't think the politics and the cultural issues are too big of a lift. So I think that you're going to see some things happen in the next 2 years. Both the governors have decided to get together in a collaborative process, and I think we might see some legislation come about. And I think some Idahoans are going to play a big role in this. So we'll see.
Will you send us that series, Rocky, so we can put it on the syllabus and take a look at it if you have a copy of it?
Which series? The 1987?
The petition, the one recommending the lower Snake dams be removed.
Yeah, I'll see what I can find on it. I've got, I don't know that it's online anymore, but it might be. But I'll send you some stuff. I will send you some stuff. I did a series in 2017 that included a column about that series.
Oh, that would be perfect. That would be great too.
I also have a few though not as many. We reprinted it, and some environmental groups paid to print 100,000 of them, of that series, that were handed out to every member of Congress back then. And
Fascinating.
I'll
Wonderful.
see-
Well, I know some students have places to go and classes that are following up on this. So I'm going to go ahead and thank Rocky one last time for the class. Please join me in doing that. And if you have a specific question or something you want to follow up on, go ahead and stay on the line for a few more minutes. Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone,
sure.
for being here today. And thank you, Rocky.